Hello, lovelies, and welcome back to another episode of Not a Floating Head. First, I want to apologize for the amount of time it has taken me to get this second episode with Dr. Vanessa up and out. I have had quite a few things going on in my life that have been very positive, but have kept me very busy. So I do want to apologize for taking so long to get this episode out. Second, I just want to make a note that there's a point in this podcast where I begin to stutter and stammer as I am trying to make sure that I am using inclusive language for LGBTQ plus community. I am a huge advocate and supporter of the LGBTQ plus community, and so I'm constantly growing and learning new ways of saying things that might be more appropriate than old ways of saying things, and making sure that I am presenting things in the most supportive way possible. So in this episode, it probably would have been better or just easier, honestly, and more inclusive if I had just said people with hormones and or people who wear nail polish, makeup, etc. With me kind of coming to that understanding, that's probably what I'll use for the future because it seems to be the easiest way to state it and the most inclusive. Okay, next thing to know, when we recorded this podcast, we actually recorded it with video. However, because it's taken me so long to get this episode out, we've decided not to bother with getting the video up on YouTube because that takes an additional amount of time. And I thought it would be more beneficial to get this podcast out as soon as possible. Okay, last and final thing to note, besides my cat running around. Okay, last and final thing to note is if you haven't gone back and listened to the first episode with Dr. Vanessa, where we talk about why the fuck am I so tired? That's the title of the episode, where we discuss chronic fatigue, chronic pain, and inflammation. This is the second part of that topic or of those topics. So if you haven't listened to the first episode of that, you may want to go back and listen to that first so that this episode makes sense. However, I do think that this episode still works as a standalone episode. It's just heaps of good information in that first episode as well as this one. Okay, with that being said, thank you so much for listening, and without further ado, away we go.
Hi everybody, this is Greg. I edit and produce these episodes of Not a Floating Head. I just wanted to give you all a heads up that the audio quality of this episode is unfortunately below our usual standards. We had some trouble with the normal microphones and had to pull the audio from the video recording. You'll notice a few loud peaks above the normal levels, typically when Dr. Watts is laughing. Otherwise, the quality is okay, just not great. Also, the interview itself ran about an hour and 45 minutes, so we're going to split it into 2 episodes with the second half coming soon. That's it from me, so please enjoy the episode.
Welcome back, lovelies, to another episode of Not a Floating Head. This is our second episode today with Dr. Vanessa. We started last time talking about chronic fatigue and inflammation, and we're going to spend a little bit more time today talking about inflammation and the driving factors for inflammation. All right, without further ado, let's talk about inflammation. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Vanessa so she can explain what inflammation is.
Yeah, so inflammation is basically, it's a turning on of our immune system, and a lot of people kind of consider this idea of inflammation as a bad thing. And really, it's such an important way for our immune system to kind of wake up, to respond to a threat, to instigate healing, and for our body to actually recover from injury and infections. So the problem really comes when inflammation doesn't get turned off, when it becomes kind of this low-grade chronic inflammation. Because what should happen is if we get an injury, if you've ever, hurt yourself in CrossFit, like it's mine.
Yes. Lots of injuries. Yeah. I'm very injury prone. I should live in a bubble.
So what happens when you get injured? Like what are the kind of, like, in terms of, like, what have you noticed?
Yeah, so for me, when I tore my ACL, it wasn't necessarily a pain response because my fight or flight had kicked in, and so I didn't necessarily feel pain, but what I noticed was that my knee was quite swollen. And my understanding is that the reason when you get an injury things swell is that those muscles are swelling to protect that injury from becoming worse, essentially. So your body is bracing where that injury is. And that's my understanding of inflammation.
Absolutely. It's your body's innate wisdom telling you to stop. Okay, we're injured, stop moving that joint, it's inflamed.
Yeah.
So, in terms of, the cardinal signs of inflammation, of course, we have this idea of swelling. There's also sometimes a lot of heat and obviously a lot of pain. And all of these are signs, you're hurt and you need to kind of stop whatever you're doing. And so what should happen is that inflammation kind of process happens, in the way it should, is, the area that's hurt gets kind of immobilized. And then as the immune system starts to wake up, there's all this signaling between the different cells. And, the body will come in and, pick up, begin the healing process. And the inflammation is really important for healing. Again, same thing when you have an infection. So if you have a virus or a bacterial infection, you tend to get a lot of swelling. Sometimes you get a fever as well. And all of these are ways that your body's, upregulating the response to be able to clear that infection or heal that injury.
So when you're speaking of viruses and infections, so when we get the flu, is that part of why we feel achy?
Absolutely.
Is because that inflammation is happening.
Yeah. And also, also why we feel fever. So, part of our immune system's inflammatory response is kicking up the heat of the body, and when the body's a little bit warmer, it gives the immune system a little bit more energy. It can help to immobilize the bacteria or the virus, but help to increase the energy of the immune cells, because they have a little bit more heat around.
So I think that's interesting to note is that Vanessa keeps saying immune system. So your immune system has a lot to do with inflammation, and both the positives and the negatives of our inflammation, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So again, inflammation is very appropriate, and the way it kind of works is, there's so many different players in the immune system. We have white blood cells, we have macrophages, we have our innate immune system and our adaptive immune system. But when that's all working correctly, when there's an injury or an infection in the body, the immune cells, they start to kind of talk to each other, and they send little text messages to tell each other what to do and how to respond appropriately to whatever the threat is. The problem happens when there's when either the texting becomes excessive and the immune system is trying to call on other cells and the other cells are not responding appropriately. And so what should happen is the immune system starts to kind of upregulate inflammation, and then we immobilize a joint, and then inflammation also is really important in injury to increase the release of stem cells to kind of come in and heal the injury. But what can happen is if that inflammatory response doesn't get turned off, if it becomes kind of low grade and chronic because there's an issue with the way the immune cells are talking to each other, that's really the problem here. And acute inflammation, appropriate inflammation when you're sick or when you have an injury is very good, and that's part of the healing process. The problem is when that inflammation doesn't get turned off, it's not resolved, and it just becomes kind of low grade, ineffective, and just kind of chronic. And now we know that, chronic inflammation is probably the root cause of almost all chronic disease, from Alzheimer's, dementia, to even metabolic syndrome and diabetes. So
there's so much research coming out now about inflammation and chronic disease, as well as mental health, which I think probably what I'll do is maybe a little bit of a shorter episode on my own or with Dr. Vanessa, depending on if she feels like it, where I talk a bit about the research and inflammation and mental health. But I don't want to throw that in today because we've got so much we're talking about with chronic fatigue. So I just want to reiterate a couple things that you said, Vanessa. So upregulate, that's a very medical term. So does that mean to like turn
ramp
on?
Up.
Yeah, ramp up, turn on.
Turn up the volume.
Yeah. And that's what we want when we have an injury, is we want it to turn on. But then what we want is it to deregulate or
Absolutely.
turn down when that injury is no longer, or when there's no longer a threat, whether it's an infection or an injury. And where chronic inflammation is no longer acute, meaning you no longer have that energy, what am I trying to say? Not energy, injury.
Injury or infection.
Clearly my brain cells aren't working so well today.
We'll come back to mitochondrial function.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. I need that. But that injury is no longer there, but your inflammation has become chronic. And I know for me that's been a big issue with my endometriosis, which we talked a little bit about in the last episode. Again, there will be an endometriosis specific episode and hormone specific episode. But what I want to say is that for me, I didn't feel any pain because the injury was gone. So there was no more pain, but the inflammation was still turned on. So you can have inflammation and not know necessarily that you have inflammation. You'll know in other ways, but it's not always through pain. Correct?
Absolutely. It's oftentimes through things like fatigue syndromes or, brain fog, things like that are big signs of...
I just gave you an example of brain fog. You're welcome. Sorry, I interrupted you.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
So that low-grade inflammation that can kind of spur on or drive chronic diseases, that's also one of the underlying mechanisms for how it does that, is that chronic inflammation actually interferes with the way our cells produce energy. It makes them less effective. And then we have this really annoying feedback that happens where inflammation turns down energy production, and low energy states in the body can spur on inflammation. So we can get kind of caught in the cycle.
Like a negative feedback loop, essentially.
Yeah, positive feedback.
Yeah, or positive, yes.
I
should know that because I'm a psychologist. I should know the difference between positive and negative. I'm a doctor. All right, let's talk about some of the things that actually, do you want to move on to talking about some of the things that actually cause inflammation?
So, a good way to think about it is the inflammation is basically like the volume switch in your immune system. So when there's injury or infection, you want to turn up the volume to get everyone excited and get everyone dancing and go to kind of respond to a threat. After the party or after, the threat is cleared, you want to turn back down the volume so the neighbors don't call noise control.
That would be me. I'd be the one calling noise control. I'm an old lady. I'm crotchety.
So the problem would be just the volume's not turned up high enough, so the immune system never gets excited enough to kind of go fight an infection or clear bacteria or actually heal an injury. And then it just kind of stays at that low volume and there's never really resolution of that inflammation.
So with all of that being said, let's talk a little bit about what some of our reasoning behind inflammation or what are some of the triggers for inflammation that doesn't turn back down when it's supposed to.
Yeah. So from a kind of a medical, biomedical, scientific point of view, the two things that activate or that cause the immune system volume or the inflammation to get turned up are, kind of fun words, are called PAMPs and DAMPs.
Ooh,
so there's they're called damage-associated molecular patterns. So there's basically little bits of protein, little bits of code that come from damage. So that's either when you damage a joint, when there's damage to a blood vessel, something like that, or a PAMP, which is a pathogen-associated molecular protein. So that would be a little bit of amino acid sequence or code that isn't your body. It's come from a bacteria or a viral infected cell or a cancer cell. So those are the things that basically will trigger the immune response. And among those things, so evolutionary, that made a lot of sense. All we had in our environment were bacteria, viruses, and we get injured. But the problem really comes around now in our modern world, is there's lots of things that the immune system kind of will interpret as a foreign invader, but it's not actually able to be cleared in the same way a bacteria, fungus, or virus would be cleared. The big things that kind of can spur on that inflammatory response are things like toxins in our environment, heavy metals, that makes cells look really weird, so the immune system will respond to those cells that maybe are contaminated with heavy metals, thinking they're a bacteria, but obviously they're not, so it's really hard to clear heavy metals. Things like pesticide residues look really weird to the immune system and can kind of turn on inflammation because the immune system thinks, what is this? I want to clear it, but it's not bacteria, it doesn't work. And so that immune response doesn't get resolved. It just kind of keeps going because there's these things coming in the body and they look weird, and it just kind of keeps that process going.
And as far as pesticides go, the popular one that everybody talks about, obviously, is pesticides on our food. But there's actually other pesticides as well. There's pesticides that you use in your garden that you might be breathing in when you're spraying your garden, your weed killer and things like that. But there's also, I don't know if you call them pesticides, but chemicals like the anti-inflammatory stuff that they put on our furniture, basically.
Fire retardants.
Fire retardants, that's it, thank
you.
Yep. That also has been known to cause problems as well. So the big popular one that everybody talks about, obviously, is eating organic food so that you hope that you don't get those pesticides on your food. But there's more than just that particular pesticide.
Absolutely. In terms of our kind of exposure to toxins is technically the incorrect word. It's toxicants. So environmental toxicants are things that will, upset the body, interfere with hormones, or, in our case, potentially increase inflammation. Our, household chemicals are a big one. A lot of the cleaning products we use, unless they're natural, a lot of personal care products. So I think Rob wants to do a whole episode on these.
Yeah.
They're a huge issue.
Speaking of cleaning products, before we move on to things like nail polish and perfumes and all of that stuff, I had an aunt that passed away from cancer. And one of the things that they think caused her lung cancer, because she never smoked a day in her life, was cleaning with bleach. She had OCD, and I mean actual OCD, not OCD tendencies. And so she would pull the stove out, she would scrub everything with bleach every day of her life, and her lungs basically wasted away. So Clorox, while Clorox is great, and we need it sometimes, that is one of those situations where you can actually see the result of the negative result of using this over time. One of the things I'm really passionate about that Vanessa and I talk about quite often are the toxins or toxicants that are in our things, like especially for people with hormones, would be our nail polish, our perfumes. I unfortunately am a big perfume. I love
essential oils.
I know, and I have so many essential oils, but I still can't let go of my perfumes. But one of the things that I think is important for us to talk about is teenagers, and I'm trying to be sensitive to the trans community as well. So I'm sorry as I stutter over my language. I'm trying to say, girls or people who identify as girls, or even people who identify as male that are biologically female. Sorry guys, I will work on my language to make sure it's inclusive. But that nail polish and perfumes and makeup and like all of these things that we put on our bodies does severely impact our hormones and can create endometriosis and all kinds of things. Obviously, I'll let Vanessa talk about that a little bit more, but we're both really passionate about making sure that we get that word out there, especially anybody who has children, teenagers that are constantly piling on the makeup from wherever it's from, Amazon. You don't know what's in it. You don't know what's in your nail polish, all of that stuff.
Yeah, and a big thing as well is, if you think about when, people identifying as women mostly, but it's also men with all the Axe body sprays and stuff. It's usually after the shower, and when we have a hot shower, basically we're opening up our pores. And if we go then and kind of douse ourselves in some of these endocrine or hormone disrupting chemicals, potentially those could you get a higher exposure rate. So it's definitely a huge issue.
Or maybe even after shave.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just being really mindful of that. No, it's a huge issue, and we'll definitely talk more about the hormone disruption because over the years, just because of all the estrogenic, personal care products, things in plastics, a lot of the things are actually known as xenoestrogens. So they look like estrogen in the body. And so, over years we've seen, since the 70s, male sperm count be decreasing. The average testosterone level in men is lower and lower. And just even in women, having too much estrogen or estrogen dominance, which drives endometriosis, potentially and other conditions, is a huge problem.
Yeah. And so that would be another potential link to inflammation as well. Absolutely. Would be all of those chemicals and stuff. Yep. Hormone disruption. Do we want to talk about hormone disruption, or what would you like to talk about next?
So another kind of driver of inflammation is our hormones and hormone disruption. So having in women, having too much estrogen, not enough progesterone, that can kind of drive the inflammatory process. But probably the biggest one in terms of hormones and inflammation is kind of the stress response and our stress hormone cortisol.
So we talked a little bit, or kind of briefly mentioned in the last episode, about fight or flight response and a stress response. And so what we're talking about here is an actual physiological stress that happens in the body. Yes, you may feel stressed, but what we're actually talking about is a physiological reaction. So I just want to say, I just want that to be very clear, because what we mentioned in the last episode is how frustrated it can be when you go to a medical doctor and you have chronic fatigue and you have these things and they tell you it's just stress, go see a psychologist. Yes, we all have stress in our life, but what that medical doctor should say is, let's look into how your stress response in the body may be negatively impacting you, right? Not just it's all in your head, you're stressed, go see a psychologist. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to talk about the fight or flight response. Most people have heard of the fight or flight response. It's a biological reaction that we're all born with. And it is that little voice in our head that tells us danger, something's wrong, okay? And what happens is we're going about our day And let's say back in the day, right, when we were living in caves, we were cavemen, we're going about picking our berries and stuff, and all of a sudden something has alerted us that there's a predator, right? So what happens physiologically in the body is our breathing is going to shift from our belly up into our chest. If we were breathing from the belly to begin with, that's a whole another episode. Most of us are not breathing from our belly.
And also how breathing can impact inflammation and our immune system.
Yes, absolutely. So your breathing shifts. It goes from your belly up into your chest. It becomes short, shallow, and rapid. So basically we start to essentially hyperventilate. Our muscles become tense. Our heart rate goes up. Blood pressure goes up. I'm just trying to think. The breathing changes. All of that changes. Because our body is priming us. It's sending all of that energy to our extremities to either stay and fight or flee, run. There is a third response called the freeze response, but we're not talking about that today. We're talking mostly about the fight and flight response, correct? And so this is whenever we get stressed. So nowadays we're not fighting off saber-toothed tigers, but we've got traffic bills, we've got children, we've got,
things on our phone.
That's right. Oh my God. Yes. Don't even get me started on social media, even though I've jumped on the Instagram bandwagon. Hi, Insta. Okay. But we've got all of these things, artificial light, which we'll talk about as well, but all of these things that are now triggering our fight or flight response. And we're actually walking around 98% of the time, I would say, in fight or flight mode, whether we realize it or not. And so constantly walking around in that fight or flight mode is like what Vanessa talked about with the dial. It's always turned up. It's never turning off because it's actually sensing that all of these things are threats. Would that be correct, Vanessa?
Yeah,
everything I've said?
And then if you think about evolutionarily, so the body only has enough kind of energy or resources, for a certain amount of things. So when our brain is giving our body, or when something in the environment is giving our body the warning signs, and we go into that stress response, your body has to prioritize. And because in that moment, the most important things are to be able to run away, or to be able to fight, the stress response also means that right now having a good, strong immune system function isn't that important. Mm-hmm. So in that stress response, you actually turn down the immune system.
That makes sense. Yep.
And then it's only after you've escaped that you need kind of the immune system to kind of come back on board. So so obviously after this fight or flight and sympathetic response kind of kicks in.
Yep.
What should happen?
Yes. Yeah, so the language that we use is sympathetic nervous system, and the way that I remember that is I think of a symphony banging and clanging very loud. That's your fight or flight response. That's your sympathetic nervous system, which we need and want turned on when we are actually in a threatening situation. Our goal in life is to balance the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic, the way I think about this, is a parachute coming down, calming down the system. Okay? And so initially when we're working with that fight or flight mode, what we want to do is we want to ramp down the sympathetic, turn up the parasympathetic, okay? Because then we're turning down that stress response. And again, when I say turn down, I mean physiologically bringing our blood pressure down, our heart rate down, we're breathing correctly from our diaphragm, nice, slow, and steady breathing. And then our energy is allowed to go to where it needs to go rather than tight muscles, and brain fog. That's another thing that happens when you have people with chronic fatigue and people with chronic injuries and illness. Then I always hear this, I can't think clearly. Something's wrong. I'm really worried I have Alzheimer's. I can't remember anything. Well, if our body's constantly in fight or flight mode, it's sending that energy elsewhere. It's not going to the brain. It's going into the muscles. And so by turning down the sympathetic, turning up the parasympathetic, we are hopefully sending that energy back to where we want it to go and need it to go.
No, I think that's a perfect example. So I think understanding that context of, the two kind of parts of the nervous system and their importance. It's just like with inflammation. It's not that sympathetic nervous system function or fight or flight is bad. It's that, we should ramp that up and then that should resolve and we have kind of the second phase. And so kind of how that ties into immune system function is during the first, fight or flight phase evolutionarily, we don't need our immune system to be upregulated. Inflammation is usually kind of pushed down, the stress hormones tend to turn down immune system function and kind of keep that quiet. And it's only after you've escaped the threat and you can kind of recover that's when you want your immune system to kind of ramp back up, and maybe you heal, whatever injury you got running away or fighting, and getting rid of any bacteria that you might have been exposed to in the fight.
Yeah. My goal as a psychologist when working with the fight or flight response is never to get rid of it. We need it. We want it. It is a good thing. It's for our survival. However, my goal, and I think Vanessa's goal, but coming at it from a different angle, is we can't take stress away. Stress is a part of life, but we want to teach our bodies how to cope with it more efficiently and effectively and in a healthy way. And so when I'm working with patients who have chronic injuries, chronic fatigue, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where all of this stress is just chronic, what we need to do is we need to bring the body back to homeostasis, teaching it that it's safe and teaching it how to actually turn off fight or flight when we don't need it. So that's my role in teaching meditation. I know people always think of psychologists like, I can learn meditation on my own. Why do psychologists teach meditation? I will either go into that later on this episode, maybe towards the end as we start to talk about things you can do to help with inflammation, or I'll do another episode on it, or both. But again, when we're teaching meditation, we're not just talking about, or I'm not just talking about you feeling less stress. I also want physiologically for your body to be less stressed. I also want you to feel less stressed as well. Yeah. But I want that turning off. I want to give you the control back of being able to ramp that back down, turn that volume back down.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, it's so important that, even my clinical practice, I've figured, it's been so important to get people's kind of stress response under control that, I even went and became a yoga meditation teacher just because, I can't help, someone with chronic inflammation, with autoimmune disease, if they're kind of stuck in that stress response. And so to kind of tie back kind of that stress response, the fight or flight and the sometimes called rest and digest and parasympathetic part of the nervous system, coming back to kind of the hormone picture and inflammation is when we're very stressed, we tend to produce two primary hormones. One is called cortisol and also a neurotransmitter called adrenaline. And those are very beneficial in the short term. But if we think about cortisol, which is our stress hormone, what it actually is if you've ever taken hydrocortisone or prednisone. Cortisol is our body's basically natural anti-inflammatory. So cortisol turns off the inflammatory response. And so when we're stressed, when we're in stress or in fight or flight, our immune system is kind of dampened down. Everything is kind of quieted down. And, you might have noticed this, that, if you were working a lot or you're very stressed, you might get sick more often, especially when it comes to viral infections. So that's kind of a bit of a connection there. But then what happens is if we have chronic stress and, we're producing a lot of cortisol all the time and we're kind of turning down the immune system, inflammation stays low. But just like in the case where we have insulin resistance, where, when people eat, diet too high in refined carbohydrates, the body makes a lot of insulin to kind of get that sugar out of the blood. And then over time, because there's so much insulin all the time, the body's cells say, holy crap, that's too much insulin. So that it becomes insulin resistance. It stops insulin resistant. It stops listening to the signal of insulin, and insulin stops working. So we have the same situation with chronic stress. So after a lot of cortisol, turning down the immune system, keeping inflammation low, all of a sudden what will happen is the body doesn't like too much cortisol. When cortisol is high for too long, we even see things like shrinking in parts of the brain, especially the hippocampus, which is why we sometimes get really forgetful when you have chronic stress. You're actually shrinking that part of the brain. Wow. But then, so that chronic cortisol release and high stress hormone release, the body kind of gets sick of that signal of, cortisol. So it becomes resistant to that cortisol. And once the body stops responding to its natural anti-inflammatory, it allows this low-grade inflammation to kind of persist beyond when it was useful. So beyond the case, beyond an infection or an injury.
Yeah.
It's a big kind of connection there.
And I know a lot of people, at least in the U.S., know about cortisol from a belly fat standpoint. That's a very
crucial.
Yeah,
cortisol.
Yeah, exactly. So I know a lot of you will go, cortisol, belly fat. I know you know about it that way, but
which is really interesting. One of the connections there probably is cortisol puts on belly fat or visceral fat because actually abdominal fat can have a lot of stem cells. So if you're stressed for a lot of time, or you're stressed a lot and your body's thinking you're going to get injured a lot because it's very stressful, then, we tend to store fat cells in our adipose tissue as we get older, and our bone marrow doesn't make as many. So it could be one of the ways your body's trying to protect you against future injuries and problems by kind of giving you a reserve of stem cells.
Stop protecting me. I want CrossFit abs.
No. Yeah.
I'm very protected.
Yeah. Right.
No, that's actually really interesting. I don't think that's not something I knew, that might be why. One of the reasons. Yeah, very interesting. All right, so since we've been talking about the gut and cortisol, maybe actually talking about gut health would be good.
Absolutely. So our gastrointestinal health is a big driver of inflammation as well. So but at any one point in time, so about 70% of our entire immune system is residing, or it's kind of in the lymph nodes and in the area around the gut. And that makes sense if you think about it, because our immune system is about protecting us from, invaders from the outside. And, our gut is basically, and our lungs obviously too, is basically the interface between the outside world and the inside world. So we have our immune system kind of lining the gut. And a lot of what goes on in the gut actually helps to educate the immune system and helps to modulate that inflammation. So either, turn it on or, keep it from turning off. When it comes to, gut function, stress in of itself, just like we talked about, if you're in a stress state, your gut doesn't work well because all of your energy is, in your muscles trying to run away. And so our gut function or digestion kind of suffers. When we have, chronic exposure to antibiotics, or we're eating, again, foods that, may be laden with, certain pesticides or antibiotics, that changes the balance of the bacteria in our gut. And the bacteria in our gut, fun fact, we actually have 10 times as many bacteria, or 10 times as many bacterial cells as we have human cells. So we're actually mostly a big ecosystem. And that ecosystem kind of talks to our immune system, and especially the ecosystem in our gut, lines and lining of the gut. The bacteria lining. Yeah. And so basically, from chronic antibiotic use, from too much stress, if we disrupt that kind of normal balance of bacteria, that changes the way those bacteria talk to the immune system, and that in of itself can kind of spur on that chronic inflammation.
And that would be where maybe IBS symptoms start to come in as well?
IBS and kind of even further on, when there's chronic inflammation in the gut from the wrong kind of balanced bacteria, that can also contribute to something called intestinal permeability or leaky gut, which you may have heard about. Yeah,
I think, again, that's a big topic in the US. I'm not sure about here in New Zealand, but leaky gut dysbiosis, and impermeability. These words are a little bit of a mouthful to say, but a lot of people know about that. And I think we'll talk a bit about nutrition as well.
And that's where this idea of food allergies comes in, because a healthy gut, we should be able to tolerate different foods. We shouldn't be reacting to almonds and soy and everything else, and wheat and everything else. But the gut should be permeable to some degree, because it has to absorb food and let things in. But when there's chronic inflammation, chronic stress, or the wrong gut bacteria, basically we have a breakdown of the cells that line the gut. And when that happens, if food particles in the lumen, in the inside of the gut, kind of sneak through and they don't get absorbed through the lining, then the immune system on the other side gets really freaked out and gets very inflamed. And that inflammation then can contribute to a lot of food allergies. Okay. So if you have a lot of food allergies, that could be due to stress, dysbiosis, or
and then would the inflammation also be part of bloating?
That definitely could be.
Because I know for me, and again with endometriosis, it's something called endometriosis belly, and that's where you get very bloated. I mean, and you look very pregnant. Like from here all the way down, you're very, very bloated. And I kept being told it was IBS and it was all of these things, and nothing I did worked until I started to see Dr. Vanessa and worked on my inflammation. And that's, working on my inflammation, which we will talk about. What are the steps to test for inflammation? We will go there. We've still got quite a few things to talk about before we get to that point, but we'll talk about that. And then of course, obviously we're not going to leave you hanging. We'll talk about things that once you've kind of put all of this information together, what are the next steps for being tested? And then what are the next steps for implementing some of these strategies to get your inflammation down?
As we keep talking about kind of this idea of inflammation, we also have to keep in mind that if the immune system is too busy kind of sending the text messages about inflammation, it's sometimes, and it's not effectively clearing, say, viruses or bacteria that come into the body, and those things become chronic, then that in itself can also kind of drive the process further. With stress hormone, we talk a lot about cortisol. Cortisol also tends to turn off our thyroid gland. So when we're very stressed, it kind of turns off our thyroid function. And when thyroid function decreases, then again, blood flow to the gut can decrease, we get bloated again, and our immune system function to be able to fight viruses and bacteria isn't as strong. And if our immune system isn't effectively clearing those things and they become chronic, then that's another kind of driver of this low-grade inflammation.
Yeah, and I know thyroid is a massive issue, and it is becoming much more talked about recently, and well, not recently, for a while it's been, but I feel like lately it's becoming people are much more aware that our blood test for thyroid is not necessarily the best indicator of a thyroid issue. I know for years I kept having my thyroid tested and being told there was nothing wrong with my thyroid, but actually in working with Dr. Vanessa and her helping me understand levels and what the levels look like, and we talked about that in the last episode about lab work, so go back if you want to learn about lab work, go back and listen to that episode. But it wasn't until we started working on all of these things, thyroid, inflammation, all of that I actually finally started to feel a lot better. But that can be an issue for people, is feeling you have every symptom of a thyroid not working and your GP or
your TSH is still good.
Yeah. So that we might even want to do a whole episode just on thyroid at some point. It's such an important thing.
And it's frustrating too, generally, because there's quite a bit of evidence showing that our TSH, which is the general screening test for thyroid, can look normal for about 5 to 8 years into kind of poor functioning of the thyroid gland. So it's definitely a big factor.
And mostly here we are we're talking about hypothyroid, which would be underactive. Thyroid, that's when you're chronically fatigued and tired. Hyperthyroid is when it's overactive and oftentimes can mimic a little bit of mania, like bipolar, where people they may feel really anxious, they may be sweating all the time, they are losing weight without trying. It's sad. We laugh and say, "Oh, I'd like a hyperactive thyroid," but you don't. It's actually very uncomfortable and can be misdiagnosed as bipolar. And hypothyroid can often be misdiagnosed as depression. So that's one of the things I look for as a psychologist when I'm taking on new patients: is have they had their thyroid tested? Has anything else? Is that a possibility of potentially what's actually going on versus a true chemical depression and a true bipolar?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a great point. There's so many physiological processes that are kind of written off as mental health disorders. I think I see that a lot as well.
And I can say my depression definitely worsened with my thyroid issue for sure. Yeah. And even though I was on medication and that was managing my depression, it wasn't until we started treating my thyroid and inflammation, again, link between mental health and inflammation as well, that I actually started to feel better than just managing. Like, I felt actually very good.
I think that's a great kind of segue. There's a couple more things we've talked about, but just kind of realizing the interconnectedness of everything. It's stress, it's hormone function, it's inflammation, it's nervous system tone, or the balance between the fight or flight and rest and digest nervous system. And it's usually not one thing. It's there's a hormonal cascade, and all of these things are connected. So I think it's really important not to look at one part of the picture and say, oh no, this isn't affecting me, because that one part is actually probably affecting all the others. And while they could all be underlined by something like chronic inflammation, that chronic inflammation will affect basically every part of the body.
And that's also why it's really important to have a team of different practitioners that work together. So you've got the psychologist that understands that there's medical stuff going on as well that's going to impact, because again, you're not floating head, so whatever's happening medically is going to affect you psychologically, and whatever's happening psychologically is also going to affect you. Like, post-traumatic stress disorder is going to ramp up inflammation, and having a team of people that are willing to work together, even if they don't necessarily work in the same building or same location, but that are willing to consult with each other. Because that's the beauty, is having a nice team of people that can kind of treat all of this, because it can also feel very overwhelming when you have all of these things going on. You don't know who to turn to. Maybe you go see a psychologist and you say, I feel a little bit better, but it didn't fix everything. Well, no, that's because the psychologist can only work on the psychology piece. Dr. Vanessa can work on the medical piece. Your GP can also work on the medical piece. All of these different, your yoga instructor can also help you with your stress. Your CrossFit coach can help you with your energy. All of that is really important to have a good team of people. Didn't mean to interrupt you, but just thought I'd take that opportunity to say that.
It's so important, and just, having someone, or having that understanding too, that, to see the bigger picture, not just kind of hone in on kind of one part and say, this is fine, so you're floating it, get out of here.
Yeah, exactly.
Stemming on from that, we talked about the gut and how that can, gut issues can drive inflammation. And then kind of just want to link that back to diet. So another big driver of inflammation is having blood sugar that's not controlled, or having kind of chronically high blood sugar, or, chronically, the wrong kind of fats in your diet. So when our blood sugar is too high, what happens is, especially if it's not disposed of quickly, so it's fine to have high blood sugar, like it's fine to be stressed, it's fine to be inflamed, but that blood sugar needs to kind of get out of the bloodstream quickly. If it doesn't, it can stick to cells. It's called glycation, fancy word. And that's why you might have had a test or heard of a test called HbA1c, which is glycated hemoglobin. So how much sugar is stuck to your hemoglobin. So whenever we have cells in the body that have sugar stuck to them, the immune system thinks that's weird as fuck. It thinks that could be a bacteria. It doesn't know what that is. And that will cause a lot of inflammation too, because your immune system is seeing these cells that look kind of damaged and weird. And it's trying to clear them, but they're not responding like a bacteria would. And so that's a big driver of inflammation as well. So getting your blood sugar under control is extremely important. Also having the right fats in your diet is absolutely critical. So kind of to back it up, the text messages, or the biological text messages that your immune system kind of sends to the immune cells send to one another, are actually often made of fats, or they're derived from different fats. So if we have different fats in our cell membranes, because we're eating, a lot of trans fats, a lot of fried foods, a lot of kind of weird things like that, the type of text messages that the body can send, made from those biological compounds, tend to be very inflammatory. So if we have a diet, rich in omega-6 oils, and that'll really drive inflammation, because that's the messages that's the text messages.
What are you getting omega-6 oils from?
So mostly from, processed foods, mostly from, if we're eating out a lot of the times.
Fried foods, absolutely.
A lot of times, we think we're getting olive oil in restaurants, but it's actually canola oil or cottonseed oil or something like that. And those fats tend to be very inflammatory. And so that balance between, they're called omega-6 or omega-9 fats to omega-3, which come from, usually marine sources, flax seeds, walnuts, things like that, in a vegan diet. That imbalance kind of drives inflammation as well, because again, the messenger is made from those types of fats. The omega-6 fats tend to make a lot of inflammatory messages, versus the omega-3s tend to help with resolution of inflammation. And things like trans fats directly, just like the sugar stuck to cells, looks freaking weird. When we see damage, when our immune system sees damaged fats, it freaks out as well. So that'll really drive the immune response. Also high, so any fats that you heat to a high degree, or rancid oils. Yeah. When those come into the body, the immune system evolutionarily has never seen, never seen that before, and that's also very inflammatory, because it's thinking it's a bacteria. What is it? It's trying to clear it.
But I know Vanessa will talk about this in a minute, but I will say, being mostly plant-based vegan, a couple years ago, I wasn't feeling well, obviously, with all of this stuff going on. But one of the things that I learned is I wasn't getting enough good fat. And in particular, as a woman, it's eating good fat, healthy fat, I think is even more important. I'm not saying it's not important for men, but it really, I think, also impacts our hormones and stuff as well. But for me, when I thought I was doing good because I wasn't eating a lot of fat, but actually it wasn't until I started adding that good fat, like avocado. And again, we're talking about a healthy portion size here. We're not talking about eating a whole bowl full of guacamole because it's avocado and we're using that as an excuse to eat it. But, getting those good fats back in, my skin started to clear up. My hair actually became more healthy. My nails started to get stronger again. So it's not just about staying away from bad fats. It's also about making sure you get incorporating those good fats. I don't know if you want to say more on that.
Yeah, no, but big plug for kind of marine fats. If you're a vegan, because the omega-3 fats are so important, and they do typically come from kind of marine sources, typically fish oils, salmon, anchovies, things like that. Because they're so important, and evolutionarily, we've kind of depended on them, our DHA and EPA. While it's as a vegan, you can make some of those. They're the longer chain fatty acids, so the EPA and DHA from omega-3s and flax and hemp and walnuts and things like that. You do really want to consider, if you're a vegan, even taking an algae-based DHA or EPA, because that DHA actually makes something called, in the immune system kind of talks, something called pro-series resolvins. So you make these things called resolvins, which resolve inflammation, and they're called D-series or E-series resolvins from EPA or DHA. So you really need those to kind of help that immune system turn on and then turn back off and quiet down.
Going back for a second, talking about toxicants, I know that's one of the concerns that a lot of people have and legitimately need to be concerned about, is when you're taking a not a good quality fish oil, you could be getting, different, what is it that all the fish have now? Mercury and all of these things. See, I don't even know because I don't eat fish, but like all of these things that you do have to be concerned about. So do you have a kind of a suggestion for how do you know if it's a good quality fish oil? And I don't even know, we may even have to worry about algae supplements as well.
Especially,
especially
because algae will bioaccumulate certain heavy metals in the environment.
So we're not getting out of it just because we're vegan or plant-based. We still have to be worried about some of these things.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, a good quality, fish or even a marine oil, algae based oil, it should kind of say on the label that it's been tested for heavy metals.
Okay.
So usually it'll have heavy metal pesticide kind of. They'll have a label about it's been tested.
Okay. Going through some sort of testing process.
Yeah. So. Okay. And generally, if we are going to consume seafood, and I do like to not just take supplements. And if you are eating a omnivorous diet, I do like people to eat some fish. If you eat lower in the food chain, you're usually safer off. So obviously, the algae and the sea veggies are at the bottom. But then sticking to fish that tend to be shorter lived, that are smaller, they tend to bioaccumulate less metals from their environment. So things like anchovies, herring, mackerel, things like that. Versus that's why they say you should eat swordfish and shark and the bigger fish, because they live longer. They eat lots of little fish, and they'll accumulate all of those toxins.
Don't eat shark. I will come after
you. Don't eat shark. No, we just love sharks. No. Don't eat shark over a shark tattoo.
Yes, exactly. Don't eat it for numerous reasons.
Yeah, it's karma. It'll kill you with that metal.
I didn't mean to throw us back to the toxicants, but I think that I just wanted to make sure I said that because I know that that's super important. Again, we want to look at good quality versus you think you're doing something. If we go back to our original name, is doing everything right. And that's one of those things is people will say, well, I'm taking a fish oil supplement, I'm doing this, I'm eating this, but also knowing your sources of where you're getting that stuff from.
The other huge factor too with especially with those omega-3 oils from fish, is they tend to be very not stable. So they're very heat sensitive, and they tend to get damaged really easily. And so if you're, say, buying a $9 bottle of 90 capsules of fish oil from somewhere,
Walmart,
then there's a high chance that the oxygen in the environment could have caused damage to those oils, and it could have been not stored properly, could be heated. And if you then take those fish oil thinking you're doing something healthy, but they're damaged or rancid fish oils, and your immune system sees that, again, it's this weird situation because evolutionarily we've only eaten nice, probably undamaged oil from real food. Not seeing
probiotics is similar as well. You want to make sure that your probiotics are good quality, and if they're supposed to be refrigerated, that they've been refrigerated. And I don't know if they'll have the same kind of inflammatory response if they're not a good probiotic, but I know that was one of the things before I started working with you, I was taking probiotics and I didn't feel like they were working. And I didn't know that it was really important if they were refrigerated to keep them refrigerated and things like that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll bring us back to topic because I kind of took us off topic. We were talking about healthy fats and the importance of healthy fats. You want to talk a little bit more about fats in general?
Fats are so important. I think, a lot of people, we're finally moving out of this kind of low-fat kind of craze. Low-fat, aka high sugar phase. And just talking about the importance of incorporating the right fats, for inflammation. We didn't really talk much, but about for hormonal balance as well. But, I'm still seeing a lot of people avoiding certain fats because this idea of, high cholesterol and lipid levels. And one thing, I just want to circle back because I always say, while cholesterol is involved in things like heart disease, cholesterol is at the scene of the crime, but it's not really the villain. And inflammation actually plays a big role here too. So cholesterol is actually the building block of our cells. So our cell membranes are made of fats. That's what the immune system uses to make those text messages to turn on inflammation or turn off inflammation. And cholesterol is a big component of those cell membranes. So what often happens is if there's damage to the body, if the body needs to make more cells, you'll see kind of cholesterol go up. And the issue is if there's a lot of inflammation in the body and there's a lot of cholesterol in the bloodstream, that inflammation will damage the cholesterol because if you think about inflammation too, we should have probably said this in the beginning. Inflammation is like a forest fire. So, it's burning the forest down and there's a lot of smoke and there's a lot of kind of stuff happening. And if there's a lot of cholesterol and a lot of inflammation, that cholesterol could be going to kind of create some new cell membranes, if there's a damage to the side of an artery. But if there's then a lot of inflammation, that cholesterol gets damaged, from inflammation, or also things like smoking, poor diet, too much free radical, not enough antioxidants, and that cholesterol gets damaged. The immune system then sees that damaged cholesterol and wants to also eat it like the bacteria. It's something weird. And if that cholesterol was going kind of to the artery to try to fix some damage in the artery, the immune system will come and try to eat it up. And that's what kind of starts the process of plaques.
Oh,
if you think of calcium in arteries, the calcium is actually after the injury to the artery and the immune system kind of trying to eat the cholesterol to help. The calcium is actually like the scar over that injury. So while high cholesterol is a problem, it's really the inflammatory response and the inflammation in the body that's actually drives the process of heart disease. Now we know that. And, one of the most important measurements, or, when I'm assessing someone for heart disease risk, is a blood test called HSCRP. So it's high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And C-reactive protein is actually an inflammatory mediator. And so HSCRP, or it's high sensitivity versus CRP, which is just not quite as sensitive blood test. So that level of inflammation is indirectly correlated to heart disease risk, independent of cholesterol. So even if your cholesterol is low, and that's why we still see vegans having heart attacks with low cholesterol.
Yep.
If there's a lot of inflammation, then the immune system is going to increase the process of potentially causing plaques.
And it's interesting, I was going to say, is one of my reasons for originally going plant-based was I at a very young age, in my 20s, all heart disease runs in my family. A lot of my family members have passed away from heart attacks. And when I was in my, must have been around 23, 24, my cholesterol shot up. Despite the fact that I ate relatively healthy and didn't actually eat a lot of meat, but my cholesterol went up. And so I started doing a bunch of research into nutrition and healthy food, and that's kind of when I came across plant-based. But what I did is I went to the opposite, where then I avoided all fats because I thought, that's going to shoot my cholesterol back up. And then realized that I needed those healthy fats for other things like hormones, skin health, hair health, nail health, all of those things that we look at.
Fun fact, all of our hormones, our sex hormones, even our cortisol, is actually made from pregnenolone, which is one step away from cholesterol. So we don't have cholesterol. If our cholesterol drops in U.S. terms under 150 milligrams per deciliter.
Yeah.
That's right?
Yeah.
Then we actually don't have enough precursor for hormones.
Yeah, because that's what I was told, is I went from having my cholesterol was too high to then my good cholesterol was too low. So I needed to, even though my bad cholesterol was low, my good cholesterol was also low. So I needed to get that back up. Didn't mean to get us off topic again, kind of going backwards, but
I'd love to do a whole cholesterol episode because because cholesterol is involved with making new cells and repairing the body. When we're stressed, because we could be getting more injured because it's fight or flight, the body's perceiving, more danger in the environment. Our cholesterol will actually go up with stress, and because stress decreases thyroid function, and low thyroid will drive cholesterol up.
Yeah. I try to tell that to patients and they don't believe me. You heard it from Dr. Vanessa, maybe you'll believe her.
And actually, especially low testosterone,
Yeah.
low cholesterol, and especially men with depression.
And I think we started talking about CRP, which is a really interesting topic. And again, something I've been doing a lot of research on because my family has a history of heart disease. What else would you like to say about CRP and heart disease and inflammation?
Yeah. So CRP is a good kind of general screen for your body's inflammatory levels. It's not that sensitive though, so you have to be quite sick or quite inflamed to see a CRP level kind of jump above 2, 3, 4, 5. So, in things like, inflammatory arthritis, like rheumatoid arthritis, things like that, you'll see it very high in certain cancers. But generally, it's a great screen, so we'll look at that. Another interesting kind of blood test that's linked to inflammation is ferritin levels. So, a lot of us, we're worried about ferritin being so low, but if we ever see it shoot up too high, that's a sign that the body is very inflamed.
Okay, lovelies, that's it for the first half of this interview with Dr. Vanessa. We'll be putting out the second half soon, which contains more great information on chronic fatigue and inflammation. As always, if you've got any questions, comments, or topic suggestions for the podcast, you can send them to notafloatinghead@gmail.com or reach out to me and follow me on Instagram, which is notafloatinghead. Thanks so much for listening. Now go have an adventure.